And you can fall into a view that says these things are demonic and these things are wonderful, and you can fall into a kind of overly simplistic understanding of life. Secondly, if you don't look at the storyline, you may be very individualistic in the way you think of salvation, like it's just me and God and I go to heaven. Whereas you take a look at the storyline, you'll see God is creating a people. First out of the children of Abraham, then out of the believers in Jesus. He's creating a body, a community. And then lastly, if you don't see the storyline, you don't recognize the fact that God is not just going to take us to heaven, but he's really going to create a new heaven and new earth. And so if you've missed the gospel as a story, or you miss the gospel as a principle, you're in trouble. Because it's possible to so stress the gospel as a story that you miss the fact that you're actually saved only by grace alone. And you can fall back into a kind of general sense that I've got to save the world and I've got to come to God and I have to give myself to him and be part of his saving program. You miss the concept of grace. But if you only have the principle and you don't see the story, you miss all the things we just talked about that come from the story. So how can you actually talk about the gospel in every book of the Bible and equally talk about the principle as well as the story? And the answer is what brings the principle and the story together is the person, the gospel person, Jesus Christ himself. So for example, you could read David and Goliath, and you could read David and Goliath like this. You could say, okay, David, he stands forth and he fights Goliath, and even though Goliath is huge and David is small, he fights him and he defeats them. And so what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is the bigger they come, the harder they fall. And that if you really work very hard and trust God, you can defeat the giants in your life, whether it's suffering or illness or whatever, okay? Well, that's a very moralistic reading of David and Goliath. In fact, what that means is it's really, you've missed the principle completely. But what if you put David and Goliath into the storyline of the whole Bible by asking yourself, who does David actually point us to? So for example, David was not just fighting Goliath, he was fighting Goliath as a substitute representative of his army, of the Israelites. So that if he won, the Israelites won, even though they hadn't lifted a finger. And if he lost, the Israelites lost. And so his victory or defeat was imputed to them. Who does that sound like? See, David risked his life to be the substitute champion to save his people, but Jesus Christ, at the cost of his life, was the substitute, our substitute champion, so that his victory is imputed to us. But here's the thing, it's not just that Jesus died, but he fought the real giants, sin and death. Because if I know that my Savior, Jesus Christ, has defeated the big giants in my life, evil and sin and death, then I can have the faith to fight the smaller giants. Now, what have I just done? I put David and Goliath into the storyline, but also I pointed us toward Jesus. Now, should we do that? Yes, because Jesus says so. At the very end of his life, not the end of his life, right after his resurrection, at the beginning of his new life, he gets with the disciples on the way to Emmaus, and he says, how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And then just a little later, with his disciples, he said, this is what I told you while I was still with you, that everything that was written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. This is Luke 24. And what this means is this. Jesus says you should read everything in the Bible as pointing to him. And that's the first reason we should do it. And here's the last reason we should do it. Not just what Jesus says, but what Kathy says. Now, Kathy is my wife. What Kathy used to always say to me is she said, you know, what's interesting in your sermons is the first part of your sermons were good. They're like a lecture. You're very good. You're very professorial, lots of information. And so we sit there taking notes as if it's a lecture, and it felt great. It felt like I was learning things. But she says, when you turn to Jesus, when you say, this isn't just about David, this is about the ultimate David, the final David, the true David, Jesus Christ. She says, suddenly everybody would put their pens down, and it wasn't a classroom anymore. It was a worship service. Suddenly we weren't talking at this level, but suddenly we sensed something. And this, in other words, their hearts, she's saying, were touched. The only way to have your heart changed is not just to look at the principles, but to see Jesus. Not just look at the story, but to see Jesus. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this series. So thank you for staying with us on this series. I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
That's all. Thank for your attention. May God bless you all. See you next video.